online, I hope that you're going to clap too, and I hope we'll give Jonathan a nice warm welcome.
Thank you so much. I should point out that the book I did in November was with a student of mine named Lydia Davis, and she and I co-edited a collection of letters that a woman from New England wrote while she taught former slaves in South Carolina during the war, and then in Norfolk, Virginia after the war, and then in Raleigh, North Carolina, to help found Shaw University. And that student of mine, Lydia Davis, now works here at the museum. She is in museum education. So I'm so pleased that she was able to land at such a wonderful institution. I'm also pleased that I was able to put on a shirt and tie and coat today. It's the first time of 2022. And one person mentioned to me that it was their first time out of their PJs in a while for a lecture. So I'm glad we could all get dressed up for this. It's really a thrill to be back in person, and especially to be here at the Mariners Museum. The first time I came here was in the spring of 2009. When I interviewed at CNU, they brought me here as part of my interview. They said, "Oh, you like the Civil War, you'll like this place." And I loved it. And when I got the job, one of the first things I did was become a member here. And I've had my membership almost continuously since 2009. I had one little gap where I think I forgot to send in a check, but other than that, I've been perfect. And so it's really an honor to be here. And the Mariners Museum has really played an important role in my family's lives. So as many of you know, through lifelong learning or things at CNU, I've got two little girls, and they've been coming to the museum for as long as they've been alive. So this is my oldest daughter, Charlotte. She'll be 9 this year. This is in 2013 with the very famous Lincoln historian, Harold Holzer. And you can't see the statue behind me at the moment, but there she is, my little angel. And of course, got to touch the monitor. So there she is there. And then we still come here today, and we were here over the Christmas break. Is this coming up? There we go. This is Charlotte and Clara. They were thrilled to meet Santa right over where the wine is now. And of course, Clara drew Abe over there at the I Am a Mariner station. So this place really is a home for our family, and it's really a thrill to be here again. Since we are here at the Mariners Museum, I'm going to focus a lot of my remarks on Abraham Lincoln and African Americans and the water. I think that would be fitting. And so I'm going to actually take us back to the early part of his life, back to 1828 and 1831. In 1828, a small-time Indiana merchant named James Gentry went to Lincoln and said, "I want you to build a flatboat and take it down to New Orleans to sell some produce and some goods." And Lincoln agreed to do this. This would be a great adventure for a young man. You go 1,200 miles down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. You see a city like you've never seen before. And so Lincoln agrees to do this, and he goes along with Gentry's son, Allen. And they begin their journey, and they're going down the rivers, and they're stopping along the way as they go. And finally, they get down towards Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And while they're there, they pull over onto the side of the river one night, and they're going to camp out and sleep there. And a group of 7 slaves from a nearby plantation saw these 2 young men there with a flatboat full of cargo and animals and so forth. And they decided to attack Lincoln and Gentry and steal the cargo, steal what was on the boat, potentially kill these 2 young men. And Lincoln and Gentry are falling asleep, and they get attacked by these men who are carrying hickory clubs. And Lincoln and Gentry are getting the worst end of this fight when Gentry all of a sudden has an idea, and he shouts, "Hey, Lincoln, get the guns and shoot." And at that moment, the 7 slaves run away, and Lincoln and Gentry get back in the flatboat and make their escape. And there's incredible irony in this moment. 1828 is more than 3 decades before about 3 decades before the Emancipation Proclamation. Some of these very men might have become free years later when Lincoln became president. Well, eventually Lincoln and Gentry made it to the Crescent City, and they sold their wares and they sold their boat, and then they spent a few days walking around New Orleans. And as they did that, they were confronted by the slave markets of the city. Now, in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, the upper South, places like Virginia and Maryland, farmers had really depleted their soil. And so the farmers began exporting their slave property to the deep South to cotton plantations. And so by the time Lincoln and Allen Gentry get to New Orleans, they are confronted with the sight of slave markets where coffles are being brought over land, or ships are being sent along the coast, and then people are being auctioned off in the broad public. And Lincoln and Gentry see this. They see the advertisements in the newspapers that are saying, for one, talked about young Virginia slaves of both sexes to be sold cheap for cash. That's what confronted these two men. The sights and sounds and smell of the slave trade were ubiquitous. And Allen Gentry, this man who went along with Lincoln, later said, "We stood and watched the slaves sold in New Orleans, and Abraham was very angry." Well, eventually the two boys made their way back up the river. It was a 3-month round trip journey. Lincoln got paid $25 for this work, and under the laws of the time, he dutifully turned that over to his father. Well, Lincoln made another flatboat trip a few years later in 1831, and I'll put another flatboat here for you to see. And this time he went at least part of the way with his cousin John Hanks. And when they got to New Orleans, apparently they went to a woman who was known as a voodoo negress, a Black woman who could tell the future. And this woman allegedly saw Lincoln and with great surprise said, "You will be president and all the Negroes will be free." Again in New Orleans, Lincoln is confronted by the slave trade. He sees it firsthand. And his cousin in 1865 gave an account of what it was like. And these are his cousin John Hanks's words. "We saw Negroes chained, maltreated, whipped, and scourged. Lincoln saw it. His heart bled, said nothing much, was silent from feeling, was sad, looked bad, felt bad, was thoughtful and abstracted. I can knowingly say that it was on this trip that he formed his opinions of slavery. It ran its iron in him then and there, May 1831. I have heard him say often and often." And upon seeing a young girl being auctioned off, Lincoln was allegedly so enraged that he turned to his companions and said, "By God, boys, let's get away from this. If I ever get a chance to hit that thing," meaning slavery, "I'll hit it hard." 10 years later, Lincoln has another experience with slavery related to the water. He was on a steamboat on the Ohio River in 1841, traveling from Louisville to St. Louis. And one night aboard this ship, he and his friend Joshua Speed see about a dozen slaves from Kentucky who are shackled together and chained to an iron, chained in irons, being transported down to the deep South. And he said the men were strung together on a single chain, just like precisely like so many fish upon a trot line. That's how Lincoln described it. Now, Lincoln thought about this, seeing these 12 men who he said were going into perpetual slavery where the lash of the master would be ruthless and unrelenting. And Lincoln noted, he thought again, and he wrote this, that these poor men, he said, are being separated forever from the scenes of their childhood, their friends, their fathers and mothers, their brothers and sisters, and many of them from their wives and children. Now, Lincoln didn't know what it was like to be a slave, but he did know what it was like to lose loved ones. He had lost his mother when he was 9, his sister when he was a teenager or just over 18. He had lost an infant brother when he was a toddler. He had lost a sweetheart who he was purportedly madly in love with as a young man. Lincoln knew the pain of such loss. And that sight on the Ohio River never left him. He never forgot what that was like. About 14 years later, in 1855, Lincoln sent a letter to his friend Joshua Speed, the one he had been on the boat with. And Speed was from Kentucky, from a slave-owning family. And Lincoln said this, "That sight was a continual torment to me, and I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio or any other slave border." And Lincoln said to Speed, the sight of seeing slaves in bondage being sold was, he said, it has the power of making me miserable. And so what we see in Lincoln's early life, when he touches interstate waterways, he is confronting slavery in a very real way. And it made deep impressions on him as a person and ultimately as a politician. Now, some of the stories, we don't know how reliable they are. We don't know if he actually met a voodoo woman who told him he would be president and free the slaves. The source from that story was written down in the 1860s. We also don't know if upon seeing a slave sale, Lincoln said, someday I'm going to hit that and hit it hard. He might have, he might not have. But what we do know is that those things would happen during his presidency. And so I want to transition to his later life. Now, I've told you a little bit about his early experiences. Now I want to tell you a little bit about his time as a president in the White House. And I've done a lot of research on this, published 2 books in the last couple of months, one just on Saturday for Lincoln's birthday. The timing was perfect. And what I found in my research was that Lincoln interacted with hundreds of African Americans as president in a way that had never happened in United States history before. Prior to the Civil War, an African American was more likely to be bought and sold by a sitting president than to be welcomed as a guest at the White House. James K. Polk bought and sold at least 19 human beings while he was president. I found in my research, I was extensive as I could, about a half dozen instances between 1800, when John Adams moves into the White House, and 1861, when Lincoln does, where a president talks to an African-American who is not a servant or a slave. But that's going to change in very fundamental ways during the Lincoln presidency. And what I found was that African-Americans boldly approach Lincoln. They do it first by writing to him, petitioning him for different things that they want or that they need, and then they begin going and meeting at the White House as well. And so I'm going to tell you some of these stories. I'm going to tell you about 2 of the letters that Lincoln received. I found about 125. I'm going to tell you about 2 that are maritime related. And then I'll also tell you about some of the stories of Lincoln meeting with African Americans at the White House. The first one involves a ship called the Challenger. And I have this advertising card from the actual ship. And this, when you look at this, you can see below here, you see the name of the ship in large print, Challenger, and beneath it, Windsor Commander. And when you see the way Windsor or the Commander is depicted here, you're going to get a very real sense of how this man thought about himself and the way he behaved towards his Black crew members. So Windsor is the commander of the Challenger. His name is Henry D. Windsor. And in April of 1861, the ship is heading from Liverpool towards New York, and they've gone about 800 miles. And on April 9th, 1861, Captain Windsor looks at a Black man in his crew. The man was named Anthony Jones, and Anthony Jones was smiling. Now, seeing this Black man smile infuriated Windsor because he believed that the Black crew was laughing at him. And so that sets the tone for what happens a few days later. A few days later, on April 21st, Windsor orders the boatswain to call the men onto the deck. And 8 of the men say they're sick and they're in the forecastle and they can't come out. And Windsor explodes with rage. He says, "I'll have them out, dead or alive. I will blow the forecastle up." Now, he tries to get these sick men to come out and they won't do it. So he gives pistols to the ship's mates. And without provocation, Captain Windsor goes up to one of the crew, a man named Thomas Woodbury. And Woodbury is just doing his duty, manning the ship's wheel. And Windsor takes a horse pistol and 2 or 3 times blows Thomas Woodbury in the head with the handle of the pistol. And blood begins to flow out of Woodbury's skull and onto his face. Captain Windsor then begins walking around the deck, barking orders at the men and threatening them. He found that man, Anthony Jones, who had smiled a few days earlier, and he takes his pistol and smashes it over Anthony Jones's head. And Anthony Jones falls to the deck. And as he falls, Captain Windsor continues to strike him. And Windsor and the officers they go to the forecastle where the sick men are, and Windsor shouts, "Let me see the man that will raise a hand here, and I will blow his brains out. And every one of you sons of bitches go out on deck." Well, the sick men, they're scared. They put on their shoes. They muster out onto the deck. And then Windsor dares them. He says, "Let me see how many of you are sick. Step out and go to the forecastle again." And 6 of these men are so sick that they stumble back to the forecastle. And at that, Windsor is enraged again. And poor Jones, the man who's been hit in the head already for smiling, gets beaten 6 more times. And he pleads for mercy. He says, "For God's sake, Captain, spare my life." And Windsor says, "No, I mean to kill you." And Jones tries to get up and get away. And one of the officers, takes a knife and stabs him in the back. And Jones cries, "Murder," as he falls over with a knife sticking out of him. The captain takes the knife out of his back and then chases down another member of the crew, a guy named Isaac Hamilton. Now, Hamilton had just seen all of this transpire, and Hamilton runs away and climbs up the rigging. And Windsor says, "Get down. I won't hurt you." And Hamilton very foolishly climbs down. And at that point, Windsor strikes him with the horse pistol. And again, Hamilton tries to run away, but this time the officers pounce on him and they punch and kick him repeatedly and pull him down onto the deck. And Windsor takes out his gun and shouts, "Let me see the man among you that will come out and fight me in a fist fight." He puts the gun down and says, I can whip any damn black son of a bitch there is in the crowd." Now, none of the men there dare utter a sound. Windsor then sees Anthony Jones, the poor man who smiled a few days earlier, who has now been beaten and stabbed, and he tells Jones to kneel down and pray. And Jones obeys, and Windsor says, "Now I mean to shoot you." And Jones begs for his life. "Pray, Captain, spare my life for God's sake." And Windsor tells the whole crew to kneel down. "Pray to your God," he says, "that you have used me wrong. You have used me shamefully." And the black members of the crew say, "We have done nothing wrong. We have only done as we were ordered." And at that, the captain just storms off and the whole thing ceases. Now, I know you all are wondering, what does this have to do with Abraham Lincoln? Well, the captain gets the ship to New York, and he has 15 members of his crew arrested for revolt and mutiny. And they are tried before Supreme Court Justice Samuel Nelson, who is a pro-slavery Democrat riding circuit. So he sits in trials in New York City. And Windsor takes the stand. And he says, "These men refused to obey my orders and they attempted mutiny." And he said, "I behaved mercifully toward them. And when they misbehaved, I merely told them to go down on their knees and beg pardon and say they were sorry." Despite all the testimony to the contrary, this judge found the 15 members of the crew guilty and sentenced them to imprisonment at this prison here for periods of 1, 2, and 3 years, depending on the man. And so these men go to prison. But they have an idea. They send a letter to Abraham Lincoln. And this is the letter here. And they write about what happened. And they said that they had done nothing wrong. And they explained the situation. And they asked Lincoln to pardon them because the president can pardon federal crimes. And something that's happened on the high seas is going to be tried in a federal court. You can see that most of these men were illiterate. It appears that only one was capable of signing his name. There's a sad thing that happens, though. Whoever got this in Lincoln's White House office thought that the Challenger was a ship in the US Navy, didn't realize that it was a private vessel. And so it should have gotten routed to the Attorney General's office, the precursor of the Department of Justice. Instead, it got sent to the Navy. And the Navy didn't know anything about it, and it just got lost. And this letter never made its way to Lincoln's desk. And so these men would serve their time out in jail. The letter is important, though, even though Lincoln never saw it, because it shows how very early in the war, African Americans see in Lincoln a president that they have a right to appeal to and to try to seek a redress for grievances. They believe he will be a president who will do something about their needs. He wasn't able to do so here because he never saw this letter, but he did do so with one other sailor, a young boy named Benjamin Brown. Benjamin Brown was a cabin boy on a ship called the George and Henry. The George and Henry was off on the west coast of Africa in 1860. And like most kids, he liked to fidget. My kids now have fidget spinners. Benjamin Brown was fidgeting with a gun, and he had a pistol in his hand and he was playing with it. The record actually says playing with the gun, and he accidentally fired it. Oh, I went backwards. No, sorry. He accidentally fired it and killed. I just lost my picture. Does anyone, do you know in the back what happened there? I might have somehow deleted the picture. I'm not sure. I just won't put Ben Brown's letter up there. Sorry, I'll leave this one up. He accidentally fired it and killed another man aboard the ship, another boy aboard the ship. And when they get back to the United States, one of the images just went blank, but it's okay. I'm not sure. It's all right. When the ship gets back to Baltimore, Ben Brown gets tried for manslaughter because he accidentally killed someone else in the crew. And he gets convicted and he gets sentenced to 3 years in prison and a $1 fine. But he also has to pay court costs. Now, Ben Brown serves his 3 years in prison. He can probably afford a $1 fine, but the court costs are $666.50. Now, the way it would work then is he would stay in prison until he paid his fine. But he's a teenager and he has not worked for 3 years. And even before that, as a cabin boy, he had not saved up that sort of money. And so Ben Brown knew that if he stayed in prison, it would turn into a life sentence, even after he had finished his 3 years. And so he wrote to Lincoln. And again, he explains his situation and he says, I've paid my debt, I've paid my 3 years, but I can never pay this massive court cost. And Lincoln reads his petition, sits in his White House office and reads it and agrees that justice has been served with his prison sentence and that it would be unjust to put him in prison for life simply because he couldn't pay a fine. Oh, it's not. Let me try one more time. There we go. So here we go. This is Lincoln's pardon of Benjamin Brown that he issued in the summer of 1863. And again, for African Americans, being able to write to the president and get a response and have a president who will listen is something that is very new in American history. Now, many African Americans also go through the White House doors. And so I'm going to tell a couple of stories of some of them. Some of them are going to be famous. Some of them are not so famous. But they all tell a story that I think has been forgotten for about 160 years. The first one, again, is going to be related to the water. This is a man named Robert Smalls. Robert Smalls was born into slavery in Charleston, South Carolina. And during the Civil War, he is working essentially as a pilot on a Confederate ship called the CSS Planter, which you see featured on the right here. And Robert Smalls, for the first 2 years of the war, is working on this ship and he's learning how things work. He also knows that there's a risk that his wife and children might be sold into slavery and sold away from him. And so in the spring of 1862, Robert Smalls concocts a daring plan. He will seize freedom by stealing this Confederate ship and taking it out to the Union blockading vessels off of the coast of Charleston. And so before dawn on May 13th, 1862, he gets himself and several friends ready. His wife comes with him, his 2 children. 15 African Americans in total join him on this daring escape to freedom. He and the men he's working with don't tell his wife and the other wives and children what they're doing because they don't want word to get out. So no one but a few men know before they begin to launch. And Smalls knows the waterways because he's been working on this ship for a while, and he puts on a straw hat that makes him look like a captain, and he knows all the signals you need so that as they're leaving the fort, or as they're leaving the harbor and they go by Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter and the other Confederate installations, he can do the signals that say, we're okay, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And because he's wearing a straw cap, he looks enough like a captain, and he's able to make it through. But the danger didn't end there, because imagine this is a Confederate ship approaching the Union blockaders. What are they going to think when they see a Confederate ship approaching? So even after making it past the guards of the Confederates, he still has to persuade the Union not to shoot upon his ship. And he comes up with a little jerry-rigged flag of surrender to show a white flag, don't fire upon us. They don't believe him at first, but eventually he proves that he is an enslaved man who has stolen a Confederate ship and brought it to freedom. And for this daring act, Robert Smalls becomes a hero in the North. Newspapers report on this daring escape. The Congress passes a law that Lincoln signs in May of 1862, giving Smalls salvage money for the part of the value of the ship that he had seized from the Confederates and turned over to the Union. And a few months later, in August of 1862, Smalls decides to make a trip to Washington, D.C. And so he goes up there, and he's invited by a Black preacher named Henry McNeil Turner to speak at Turner's church, Israel Church in Washington. And Robert Smalls, a man who has lived in bondage his whole life, is now on the big stage in Washington. 1,200 people come to the church to hear him tell his story. And Turner is so moved by it that Turner calls him a living specimen of unquestionable African heroism. And newspapers say that Robert Smalls' name is one that will go down in history for his brave and daring fight for freedom. Now, while he's in Washington, D.C., Smalls also decides to go and meet with Abraham Lincoln. At this point, only somewhere between 5 and maybe 8 African Americans have met with Lincoln in the White House. So Smalls is one of the first. And he goes to the White House, and we don't know exactly what was said between the two men, but we have to imagine that Lincoln said, "Can you tell me about what you did in Charleston? I really want to hear that story." And we have to imagine that Smalls very proudly told him the details of how he'd made his escape. Now, why does this meeting matter? Well, most of you probably know that for the first 2 years of the war, Abraham Lincoln opposed allowing Black men to serve in the military. There were political reasons for that. Lincoln knew if he allowed Black soldiers to fight, that it would cause massive resistance among the white electorate in the North. It would cause the border states to potentially secede. Politically, it would be very bad for the Union. But we know that Lincoln also questioned whether or not Black men would fight with courage. On one occasion, Lincoln said to some visitors that he feared that if they put the guns in the hands of Black men, that they would very quickly wind up in the hands of the Confederates. And so 1861, most of 1862, Lincoln says Black men cannot serve. August of 1862, an African American comes to the White House, tells Lincoln his story, and Lincoln sees that Black men can fight with great courage. And Robert Smalls returns to Beaufort, South Carolina later that month, carrying a letter from the War Department authorizing the arming of Black men, that the Department of the South can now begin recruiting among the formerly enslaved population there. And I think that in this moment, a conversation with an African American helped change Lincoln's mind about something that would be a really important public policy. Some of Lincoln's visitors were very famous. I'm sure all of you recognize Frederick Douglass here. Douglass met with Lincoln 3 times. In August of 1863, Douglass went to the White House and met with Lincoln. This time was an uninvited visit. Douglass had been recruiting Black soldiers for the Army throughout the year of 1863. 2 of Douglass's sons had enlisted in the Army. And when Douglass recruited black soldiers, he said, you will be paid same amount as white soldiers, $13 a month. But the War Department decided that black soldiers would be paid as laborers rather than soldiers, so they would only get $10 a month. And on top of that, they would have an additional $3 deducted from their pay. So instead of making $13 a month like they were promised, they're getting $7 a month. And Douglass is furious, rightfully so, about this. The other issue that black soldiers are facing is that Jefferson Davis has said that black men caught on the battlefield, captured on the battlefield, will be treated as slaves in insurrection, and they will either be executed on the spot or sold into slavery. And so Douglass goes to the White House uninvited, shows up and meets with Abraham Lincoln, and he presses Lincoln on these issues. You have to protect Union soldiers. You have to give them equal pay. Now, Lincoln tells him that he understands the importance of retaliation, but Lincoln doesn't really like the idea of retaliation. He worries about what that could lead to, and he doesn't want to execute a Confederate POW who's been captured for the crime, the war crime of someone on the battlefield. And on the issue of pay, he says that if he were to give black men equal pay, the white electorate in the North would have a massive backlash. And so black soldiers need to consider freedom as part of what their compensation. Now, Douglass was not fully satisfied with these answers, as you might imagine, but Douglass did go away from this meeting with a new appreciation of Lincoln's concern for the plight of black soldiers and also the different political concerns that Lincoln was juggling. A few months later, Douglass gave a speech and he said, I suppose you would like to know how a black man was welcomed at the White House. And Douglass said, he welcomed me as one gentleman would greet another. And he said, I felt big there. Well, Douglass would go back to the White House a year later in August of 1864. This time it was at Lincoln's invitation. As many of you know, the summer of 1864 was a very bad time for the Union war effort. Ulysses S. Grant was stuck outside of Petersburg. He couldn't capture Petersburg or Richmond. William Tecumseh Sherman is stuck outside of Atlanta, and Northern morale is plummeting. And Lincoln is convinced that he will lose re-election. So he calls Douglass to the White House, and the two men sit down together. And Lincoln says to Douglass, Douglass, I hate slavery as much as you do. But the problem is the slaves are not running away as fast as Lincoln had hoped would happen after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And so Lincoln says to Douglass, we need to come up with a plan to get the slaves to run away now. Because if I lose the election in November, I'm going to be out of office next March. And the president who succeeds me is going to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation, and the golden opportunity for freedom that exists now will be gone. And so Lincoln and Douglass concoct a plan modeled somewhat after John Brown's harebrained Harper's Ferry raid. And the plan they come up with is to send bands of scouts into the Confederacy, essentially shouting, run away now, run away while Lincoln is in office, because when he's out, you'll lose that chance. Now, fortunately, as you all, I think, know, things got better for the Union war effort. The Atlanta falls to Sherman, Sheridan rides through the Shenandoah Valley, Mobile Bay falls, and Lincoln sails to victory. But this moment is tremendously important because it captured for Douglass that Lincoln's heart was fully in emancipation. Freeing the slaves in this way had nothing to do with military necessity or winning the war, which is how we usually think about the Emancipation Proclamation. It had everything to do with making freedom as broad and as permanent as possible. And after this meeting, Douglass grew to have a tremendous fondness for Abraham Lincoln. They would meet again one more time. I know I'm going to run out of time, so you'll have to get the book if you want to know the third story. Another famous person that Lincoln met with was Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth came to the White House on October 29th, 1864. They sat down together and looked at a Bible that the Black community of Baltimore had given Lincoln the month before. They had a really interesting conversation about the meaning of freedom. And when Sojourner Truth left the White House, she said that she felt she was in the presence of a friend. There were a lot of people who were not well known who met with Lincoln. I've told you about some famous ones. Robert Smalls, who would go on to become a congressman for 10 years. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. But other lesser known Black men and women also go to meet with Lincoln. These are two men here, Alexander Augusta and Anderson Abbott. Alexander Augusta was born in Norfolk, Virginia in the 1820s, born into a free Black family. They went to Baltimore at some point in the 1830s, I think probably in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion. Augusta wanted to become a doctor. He applied to the University of Pennsylvania, and they would not admit him on account of his race. So he moves to Toronto. He becomes a medical doctor there and then trains other Black doctors, one of whom is this man on the right, Anderson Abbott. And in January of 1863, Augusta writes to Lincoln and says, "I want to be of use to my race." And Lincoln and the War Department welcome him down to Washington, D.C. to be examined to become an Army surgeon. The examiners look at him and say, he appears to be of African descent. And they ask the War Department to rescind his invitation. But the Lincoln administration says no. And so he is examined, and they put him through the most rigorous exam they could think of. And afterwards, the Surgeon General goes to the examining doctor and says, "I say, Cronin, how could you let the N-word pass?" And the examining physician says, "The truth is, sir, the N-word knew more than I did, and I couldn't help myself." And so Augusta becomes an Army doctor, the highest ranking Black officer of the Civil War era. His travails, though, do not end there. He faces incredible discrimination. He is beaten up by rowdy mobs in Baltimore wearing his uniform. He is kicked off of streetcars in Washington, D.C., but he decides that he will make a stand. And one night in February of 1864, these two men put on their Army uniforms. They go to the White House. They walk through the door. They take off their coats and hand them to a servant, and they get in line to meet Abraham Lincoln. Anyone who wanted to could go to a White House reception. The thing is, up to that point, pretty much only white people did it. These two men decided that they would break down the barrier. And they go in, and Augusta walks up to Lincoln with his hand extended, and Lincoln eagerly goes over to shake his hand. And Mary Lincoln sees this and does not like it. And she sends her son Robert over to the president, and Robert says, "Are you going to allow this intervention?" And Lincoln turns to his son and says, "Why not?" And Robert slinks back over to his mother, and Lincoln turns back to Augusta and shakes his hand again, and then turns to Abbott and shakes his hand. And the two men then spend a half hour walking through the East Room of the White House, this beautiful room. And as they walk, the crowd of white people just sort of separates around them. And there are looks of anger and disbelief and wonder on the faces. And Augusta later wrote about this and said, "We tried to look at the paintings like we were paying attention, but we just couldn't. It was just too hard with everyone else who was staring." They, when we talk about monuments to the Civil War, Alexander Augusta is a Virginian. He's from Norfolk. He's someone I would love to see at some point a monument built. I don't know what time I should wrap up. I guess about 7:50. Does that give me 3 minutes? 7:55. How about we do that? They told me my mic has 7 hours worth of battery, so I can go really as long as you guys want me to. After Black men begin serving in the Army, they begin to push for the right to vote. Some of you might have seen in the Daily Press and the Virginian Pilot, the day before Lincoln's birthday last week, I had a guest editorial about one man from Norfolk named Richard Parker who met with Lincoln to push for the right to vote. He went from here up to DC and met the president. Another man who did that was this guy here, Abraham Galloway. Abraham Galloway was born into slavery in North Carolina, and he escaped to freedom in the hold of a turpentine ship. He and another man, they hid down there, made it to Philadelphia, and by the time they got there, the turpentine, the chemical reaction had caused their pores to open up, and they were just seeping blood, but they were finally free. When the Civil War comes around, he begins to work as a spy for Benjamin Butler, And once the Union Army has a hold in North Carolina, he becomes the center of Black military recruitment in his part of North Carolina. And in the spring of 1864, he and 5 other Black men, some who had been born into slavery and some freedom, go to Washington, D.C. to meet with the president. And they bring a petition with them. And they say Black men could vote in North Carolina between 1776 and 1835. And there was never any problem. And by the way, Black men served in the American Revolution and the War of 1812 and are serving now. And we should have the right to vote. And they show up at the White House and they don't expect to be welcomed in, but they are welcomed through the front door. One of them later says, if I went to the home of the lowest magistrate in Craven County, North Carolina, I would have been told to go around to the back door because that was the place for N-words, is how this Black man put it. But he said, when we went to the Lincoln White House, we were welcomed in through the front door, taken into his office, and he shook our hands and listened to us. And Lincoln said that, yes, they should have the right to vote. Lincoln began working behind the scenes to push for Black suffrage, beginning in the spring of 1864. Again, I believe it's his meetings with Black delegations that push him on this issue. He'll finally come out publicly April 11th, 1865, in a speech at the White House, where he says that Black men who have served in the army or are educated should be given the right to vote. And in the audience that night was a young actor named John Wilkes Booth, who said that means N-word citizenship. That'll be the last speech he ever gives. By God, I'll put him through. And of course, we all know what happened a few days later. Lincoln would travel around Washington, D.C., and I'll close with just 2 stories here. Lincoln would travel around Washington, D.C., and he interacted with people in a very humble and genuine way. And it didn't matter what the color of their skin was. In May of 1862, he went to a hospital to greet convalescing Union soldiers. And a nurse there introduced him to 3 Black workers who were working as cooks, one of whom had been a slave from Kentucky. And Lincoln went up to the first one, a woman. Her name was Lucy. And he said, "How do you do, Lucy?" And he put out his hand and shook her hand. He next went up to the 2 men and said, "How do you do, Garner? How do you do, Brown?" He took the time to listen to what their names were and to repeat their names when he shook their hands. And the nurse who introduced Lincoln to these 3 cooks looked around and she saw the anger that the white soldiers had. How could the president treat these lowly Black cooks in this way with dignity? The nurse said that the Black cooks stood there with their faces shining in amazement and joy for all time, while the white soldiers called it a mean, contemptible trick to introduce those damn N-words to the president. And this captures, I think, Lincoln did not care what other people around him thought, and he treated people with dignity. The last story I'll tell is about this scene here. This is the contraband camp in Washington, D.C. And this is where Black refugees would flock to find freedom from Virginia or Maryland. And Abraham and Mary Lincoln would go to this contraband camp and greet the slaves and sing with them. And in this photograph, this very rare photograph, if you look carefully, you can see the people holding songbooks. They're preparing for a visit from the president. And Lincoln would show up and sing with them. And there's a woman named Mary Dines, who was a young woman, a refugee from Maryland, who sang with Lincoln and gave us accounts of what it was like. And she said the president had a sweet voice, and it sounded so sad when he tried to follow her. And he really choked up once or twice. One time, Lincoln showed up and said to Mary, "Well, Mary, what can the people sing for me today? I've been thinking about you all since I left here, and I'm not feeling so well. I just want them to sing some more good old hymns again." And Lincoln found a spiritual connection and solace in singing spirituals and hymns with these people who were living in really difficult situations, but he treated them with equality. And it's little wonder then that when Lincoln is assassinated, it's African Americans who feel the loss of the president, I think, in a greater way than anyone else. For the first time, they have come to see the man in the White House as their president, as their friend. They've come to see the White House as their people's house too. They are citizens and they will claim the right to claim to be constituent of the president. A Black Army veteran said this after Lincoln's assassination: "Our faith was almost staggered. That faith, which had sustained us in so many battles, was now staggering under a blow which was severer than battles, the death of our immortal leader." And so I'll bring things back, since we're at the Mariners Museum, I will bring things back to the Navy with Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, because I think he captured this dynamic better than any other witness at the time. Welles said this in his diary: "I saw several hundred colored people, mostly women and children, weeping and wailing their loss outside of the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue on the day that Lincoln died." Wells said, "This crowd did not appear to diminish through the whole cold, wet day. They seemed not to know what was to be their fate, since their great benefactor was dead, and their hopeless grief affected me more than almost anything else, though some strong and brave men wept when I met them." And so I thank you again for having me. I'm really excited about this story of the interactions of Abraham Lincoln with African Americans, because I think it's one that's really important for us to recover in our time 160 years later. So thank you. Sure.
Well, Jonathan, I have to tell you, you are a phenomenal storyteller, and on
you.
behalf of everybody here, yeah, and watching online, thank you.
Thanks.
So we have a little bit of time for questions and answers, and we're going to be fielding them both from the floor here. Just raise your hand if you have a question, and if you don't mind, wait until either Olivia or Sarah is able to get the microphone over to you so that the folks online can hear what the question is. We can all hear what the question is. Jonathan, most importantly, can hear what the question is, and then we'll do this for just a few minutes here before we wrap up. So, Olivia, if I can hand this to you.
Thanks. I think there's one in the back.
That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
What was the public's response to the visits of the African Americans to the White House?
It's a great question. The question was, what was the public's response to all these visitors coming in? One of my sources for these stories are contemporary newspapers. So I looked anywhere I could. I find letters and diaries, but a lot of newspapers reported on these visits. And one of the things we have to realize is that the press was unabashedly partisan then. Now that might sound a little familiar, but now we pretend like the press doesn't take sides, right? But then they just said, like, I'm a Republican newspaper editor. We are a Democratic newspaper. We are a Whig paper. There were they didn't have a conception of like modern journalism. And so in answer to your question, it depended on what newspapers you were reading. If you're reading Republican newspapers, you're going to see a generally positive reaction to these sort of things. But if you're reading Democratic newspapers or Southern newspapers, which are picking up the stories, you're going to see a very different story. Democrats are going to say Abraham Lincoln is trying to turn Black people into social political equals. This war is a revolution in a way that should not be happening. We've got to vote Lincoln out of office. I found a Confederate diarist who read these reports in the newspapers and said, this justifies secession. Look at what Lincoln's doing in the White House. We were right to secede. Frederick Douglass, I think better than anyone else, understood the importance of what Lincoln was doing. And one of the things we've got to understand about Frederick Douglass is that Douglass's view of Lincoln changes a lot during the Civil War. So when Lincoln is elected president and inaugurated, Lincoln's view of slavery is, I will protect it where it's protected by state law. I will stop it from expanding into the territories. And as much as I hate it, I will enforce the Fugitive Slave Act because that's the law of the land and the president has to execute the law. So that's Lincoln's position. And Frederick Douglass says, Lincoln, and these are quotes, Lincoln is the South's greatest slave hound and abolitionism's worst enemy. And Douglass says the South has no reason to secede because Lincoln is going to protect slavery. Now that's Douglass at the beginning of the war. But then Douglass meets Lincoln. And Douglass's views, I talked about how Lincoln's views change, Douglass's views change as well. And Douglass comes to see that there was an incredible political cost for Lincoln to be welcoming in the way he was. And at one point, Douglass said, nothing could be made to bring about hatred from Northerners like welcoming African Americans into the White House. And he said, but yet Lincoln did it anyway. And one other thing I'll just very briefly point out, it was not normal for a white person to shake a black person's hand in 1862. Reformers and abolitionists, people who we would often think of as radicals, would not do it. I write about one man in the book named Paschal Randolph, who is a sex magician. And if that doesn't pique your interest to buy the book, I don't know what will. Paschal Randolph went to New York and met with an abolitionist named Francis Shaw. And you all probably heard of Francis Shaw's son, Robert Gould Shaw, the colonel of the 54th Massachusetts in the movie Glory. Well, Paschal Randolph, this black sex magician, goes to meet with Shaw's father to talk about what they can do to work together for the freedmen. And Shaw's father very rudely kicks him out of the office, will not acknowledge him, says, come back when I'm ready for you. And Randolph is convinced that the only reason this abolitionist reformer treated him that way was the color of his skin. Randolph then meets Abraham Lincoln and has such a positive experience that he writes a letter to Lincoln later and dedicates his 1863 book to honest Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was way out of step with the norm. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that, but he was very different. And Northerners took notice, Southerners took notice, and depending on their political persuasion, I think even most white Republicans wouldn't have been supportive of what he was doing, or certainly wouldn't have done it themselves. But I think it's a really remarkable thing that Lincoln did. Question from online?
Yep, is from Carl Jackson, and he's asking, did Frederick Douglass have any role in convincing Lincoln to make the Emancipation Proclamation?
It's a great question. Did Frederick Douglass have any role in the Emancipation Proclamation? The short answer is no. The two men didn't meet until 8.5 months later. They don't meet, so it's issued, Lincoln decides to issue an Emancipation Proclamation in June and July of 1862. He tells his cabinet July 22nd. He does his preliminary proclamation September 22nd, 1862, and then the final one on January 1st, 1863. The two men don't meet until August of 63. That said, Douglass is putting on a lot of pressure in his newspaper. And so Lincoln is certainly aware of what abolitionists are pushing for. And so while there might not have been a direct connection between Lincoln and Douglass, there was certainly a feeling in the room of things have got to move this way. And Douglass is one of the people who's creating that feeling. The mic will come up to you in 1 second.
With regard to the Emancipation Proclamation, it really did not free slaves in Norfolk, Princess Anne, West Virginia, Elizabeth City, only in the states that were Confederate states and so on. So how did that work out? It's brilliant for Abraham Lincoln to bring that about, right?
Yeah. So Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation in a way that was very legal. He knew that it might get challenged in the courts, and he knew that Roger Brooke Tawney, a former slave owner, pro-Confederate, is still the Chief Justice of the United States. And this is the guy who wrote the infamous Dred Scott decision in 1857. And so Lincoln was very concerned that the Emancipation Proclamation might get struck down in the courts. And so he wrote it very carefully. He crafts it as a war measure. He says that as commander-in-chief, I can free the slaves in areas of rebellion as a military necessity, as a way to win the war. And so he doesn't free the slaves in areas that are under Union control because it's not a military necessity to do it there. And so you laid out some of the areas. And one of the things I love to tell my students is if you go to, I learned this from Carson Hudson, who many of you know, he's played music here on a number of occasions and has done a lot of work on Williamsburg during the Civil War. If you go to Colonial Williamsburg and you go down Duke of Gloucester Street, in 1863, that was the border between James City County and York. And so the slaves on one side of the street were declared free, and the slaves on the other side of the street were not declared free under the Emancipation Proclamation. But what Carson Hudson shows in a book he did about 2 years ago on Williamsburg is that in practice, in Williamsburg, they treated everyone as free. The Union Army is there. They're going to treat people as free, regardless of which side of the street they lived on. And ultimately, what Lincoln hoped for is that as the Union Army moves forward, freedom moves with it. And as more land gets taken over, more people become free.
Okay, our next question, I'm actually combining two into one.
Okay.
One from Anonymous and the other from, let's see. What Elmore popped in, sorry. Well, basically they are asking if Abraham's wife was just as enthusiastic about what he was doing.
Yeah.
If she was.
Mary Lincoln is a really tough nut to crack. And I don't mean that as a pun. I'm sorry for those of you who know stuff about Mary Lincoln. I saw like 2 smiles out there. So Mary Lincoln grew up in Lexington, Kentucky in a slaveholding family. She was surrounded by slavery as a young woman. She was used to a very elite lifestyle. And I told the one story about Alexander Augusta. She was not thrilled with the idea of these 2 Black doctors coming in to this party. Lincoln let it be known in 1865 that, or right before New Year's, his sort of party newspaper in DC issues an announcement that all people of all colors will be welcome at the New Year's reception. It would be on January 2nd because New Year's Day was a Sunday in 1865. And the Black community of Washington, DC lines up with the white community of Washington, DC to go in and meet the president. Hundreds of African Americans. This is unprecedented. And some of them begin to make it through. And then Mary is not happy about this and orders that they not be let in until all the white guests have come through first. Now, I don't know whether or not Lincoln was aware of that decision. I do know that when the white guests were done, Mary was done shaking hands. Lincoln stayed and did shake the hands of all the African Americans who waited till they could come in as well. So I don't want to make the case that the color line is completely broken down at the White House. It's not. But there are major steps in it. Now, there's a story about Mary having tea with an African-American at the White House that scholars debate. Some people think it's true. Some people think it's not true. The story comes from later in the 19th century. So I'm not going to speculate on that one, but I will say I did find a moment in the summer of 1863 where some Black men come to the White House in the evening and have tea with Abraham and Mary Lincoln in one of the social spaces of the White House as they're just conversing in a friendly manner. And people in New York, in Poughkeepsie, New York, where these men were from, were so touched by this that the Black community of Poughkeepsie issued resolutions thanking Mary for her hospitality. In the book, I recount Mary's interactions with a couple of Black women. The most famous one is a former slave named Elizabeth Keckley, who would become who was a seamstress for Jefferson Davis's wife before the war, and then for Abraham Lincoln's wife during the war. Mary was very close with her. And after Lincoln's assassination, Mary kind of holed herself away in the upstairs part of the White House, not wanting to see anyone. And the only 2 people she really allowed to be with her in those days after the assassination were Elizabeth Keckley, the Black seamstress, and the wife of the Black butler, a woman named Mrs. Slade. So Mary did have some things that you might call a friendship with Black women. On the other hand, she did things that tried to stop the breaking down of color barriers. She's a complex person, and there's a reason that scholars really argue about her, because there's not easy answers with her. Way in the back.
I got to read the first page of your book while I was waiting for your lecture to start.
Oh, thanks.
And I was not aware that there was such a backlash against statues of Lincoln in various parts of the country, as far as, Black people wanting to have removed because of, I guess, I don't know. Can you tell me why? Because that seems to contradict everything you say in your book.
Yeah.
About Lincoln being the friend of slaves and the Black people. And but do you know why they want to have the statues removed?
Sure.
Is there something he didn't do or should have done, or what's the deal with that?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I open up and close the book. I'll get you to the last page in one sentence. I open and close the book with statues of Lincoln. Beginning in the summer of 2020, obviously Confederate statues started to come down, sometimes in legal ways, sometimes in illegal ways. And Lincoln statues have also come under attack. So one of the ones I talk about in the beginning of the book is in San Francisco, where a statue of Lincoln was doused in red paint to signify blood. A statue on the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus, there are a number of students who would like to have that taken down. The statue of Lincoln across from Parliament in London has been vandalized. The statue of Lincoln in Bennington, Vermont has been vandalized. And the most famous one to kind of become controversial is the statue of Lincoln in DC in Lincoln Park. And that is a statue that features Lincoln standing like this over an enslaved man who's on his knees, breaking chains, rising. And so the reason it's controversial today is because of the pose. The pose is Lincoln standing, an enslaved man kneeling. Now the man is rising. The sculptor changed it to make his muscles tense so that it's supposed to signify movement, but the reality is it's a pose that we would not do today if we were making a statue. And so in the summer of 2020, that statue in particular got a lot of attention. A student at Howard University started a movement to try to have it taken down. Eleanor Holmes Norton, the delegate in Congress representing the District of Columbia, introduced legislation to have it taken down. And huge crowds were gathering, so much so that they had to put massive barriers around it. And I went there in the summer of 2020 and got my picture with my wife and kids outside of the barriers. I asked the publisher to use that as my author photo, and they said it was too unconventional. And I like a little bit of unconventional, but they wouldn't go for it. At any rate, here's the very quick story of that statue. April 15th, 1865, Lincoln dies. There's a woman living in Marietta, Ohio, named Charlotte Scott. She had been born into slavery in Lynchburg, Virginia. Her owner was a Unionist who moves to Marietta, Ohio during the war after having spent time in Libby Prison and other prisons in Richmond. And he takes his enslaved people with him, but when they go to Ohio, he has to free them. And so she becomes free. April 15th, 1865, Charlotte Scott learns that Abraham Lincoln has been killed. And she says, "The colored people have lost their best friend. I will give the first $5 I earned in freedom towards the erection of a monument in his honor." Now, here's what's crazy. There were Black leaders like Frederick Douglass and Henry Highland Garnett and lots of famous people of the era who tried to raise money to do a statue. They didn't get it done. This woman got it done. She gave that money to her former owner, who passed it on to someone else, and it led to a collection of almost $20,000 completely funded by Black veterans and former slaves. And they have this monument built. Now, the design of the monument was selected by white patrons, And so that leads to a complex part of the story. But the monument is unveiled in April of 1876, on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. Frederick Douglass delivers the speech at the dedication. I assign it to all my students every semester. It's one of the most remarkable speeches. I close the book with it, so you can see what I tell my students if you read my book. My view is, I wish that statue would stay in place, but that we would add more statues. And I can see Howard coming up. So I'll close with this. In the summer of 2020, I discovered with a friend a letter that Frederick Douglass wrote in April 1876, where he said, there is room in Lincoln Park, there's room in Lincoln Park for more than one monument. And he said, the story of emancipation can't be told in one statue. And Douglass called for people to put in more statues that told a bigger picture of emancipation around that one of Lincoln and Lincoln Park. And sadly, Douglass's letter was lost from 1876 until the summer of 2020. And my friend and I found it. We were interviewed by major newspapers and NPR. I mean, it was like the biggest media blitz I've ever had in my life. And it was great. I hope that people will listen to Frederick Douglass. I hope that Alexander Augusta someday gets a statue. I hope that some of these other figures get their due in statuary, and that we celebrate this much bigger story than I think we've known for a long time. So thank you.
And Jonathan, I just have to say it again, your talk was absolutely informative, but really was also inspiring. And so to the folks that have watched online tonight, have a good evening. And for those that are here, Jonathan's agreed to sign books. We'll be in the concourse here. If you don't mind letting him make his way there, because sometimes we all ask questions right here and it's an hour before he gets that way. But he'll head that way right now, and I'm sure we'll be happy to answer another question or two as he's signing your book. Thank you again for being here, and I hope you really enjoyed this format. Give us feedback one way or the other. Thank you. Have a good night.